Mr. Charles, Mr. Green, Mr. Morgan, Mr. Hutchinson, Mr. Terry Long, Miss Smith, Dr. Dunn, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Mr. Main, Mr. Davis, Mr. Witter, Mr. Brown, Dr. Brownberg, Dr. Charles, Mr. Chin, Mr. Clark, Mr. Cousins, Ms. Crawford, Ms. Daly, Ms. Davis, Mr. Golding, Mr. Graham, Dr. Guy, Ms. Hamilton, Ms. Hannah, Mr. Henriquez, Mr. Henry, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Lawrence, Ms. Lee, Mr. Miller, Mr. Montague, Ms. Morrison, Mrs. Nita Garvey, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Siblist, Mr. Slowly, Mrs. Vaz, Dr. Wheatley, Mr. Williams, Mr. Wilson, Mr. Wright. Dr. Chang?
Statement by ministers.
Madam Speaker, there will be two ministers giving statements this afternoon. Minister Marlene Malou-Fort will give a statement, and then thereafter Minister Tufton. There won't be any statement from Minister Clark. He said it's not necessary again. Okay? So, and in respect of the statement from Minister Malou-Fort, Madam Speaker, we're asking for a suspension of the standing order for her to go beyond 12 minutes. As she says, the statement may be a bit lengthy. So I ask for approval for the suspension of the standing order to allow her to make her statement without interruption.
The question is that we suspend the standing orders and that we allow for the completion of the minister's statement in this segment, statement by ministers. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. Minister Malou-Fort.
Madam Speaker, thank you, and thank you to colleagues for suspending the standing order in respect of the time to enable me to deliver the statement without interruption. Madam Speaker, when I made my contribution to the sectoral debates earlier this year, I indicated that a constitutional reform committee was to be named in short order as a next step in the constitutional reform process. Since then, Madam Speaker, I had reason to step back and reassess how the work should proceed against the backdrop of work already done in the field. Consequently, I took the deliberate decision to delay naming the committee until certain internal stock-taking was done. It has taken some time to do a thorough review of the journey we have taken so far. But, Madam Speaker, I'm very pleased to advise the Honourable House that that part of the work is now complete, which culminated with a submission to the Cabinet and certain decisions taken by the Cabinet. This ministerial statement is therefore intended to provide an update to this Honourable House and to the people of Jamaica on the constitutional reform work undertaken over the years, the matters on which bipartisan and broad consensus was reached, what was implemented, what remains to be done, and of equal importance, Madam Speaker, a consideration of whether assumptions continue to hold true and the perspectives that existed at the time continue to exist now, given the lapse of time between then and now. By way of background, Madam Speaker, I should inform the Honourable House that a lengthy constitutional reform work with the establishment of the Constitutional Reform Division in the Ministry of Justice some decades ago. Research and technical support of the division proved invaluable to a Joint Select Committee on Constitutional and Electoral Reform, which was appointed in 1991. You know, Madam Speaker, I think only a handful of persons present in the Parliament today was around then. I know the Deputy Prime Minister was in the Parliament at the time and in fact was a member of that committee. But we have new members in the Parliament, we have new ministers in government, and there can be no assumption that everyone knows what has been done so far. The mandate of that 1991 Joint Select Committee on Constitutional and Electoral Reform was to review the Constitution and make recommendations for its reform. Following on the recommendations, it was decided that a new constitution should be framed and that the Parliament should establish a constitutional commission charged with the responsibility of soliciting the views of all Jamaicans and providing a report on the outcome of its consultations. Madam Speaker, the committee tabled two reports, its first and its final report, and they were submitted in 1993 and 94 respectively. And the report included an examination of Chapter 3 of the Constitution, the chapter on fundamental rights and freedom. Madam Speaker, there was a time lapse. The next stage of the work was with the tabling of a green paper in Parliament in May of 2007, with a proposal that following the next general elections, a bill establishing a new constitution was to be brought to the Parliament. Madam Speaker, it is important to point out that the Green Paper did not depart from the recommendations of the Joint Select Committee on Constitutional and Electoral Reform. In fact, the recommendations urged parliamentarians to acquaint themselves with the reports with a view to achieving implementation of the recommendations. The following section of the Green Paper is instructive. It indicated that the report presented in 1995 and subsequent deliberations have indicated a wide area of agreement that the assumptions that underlie the present Constitution no longer reflect the prevailing sentiments either in either political parties or in the nation. Madam Speaker, 2007 there was a general election. Following the outcome of that general election, some major constitutional reform work was done. It culminated with the replacement of Chapter 3 of the Constitution with the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedom. But it is against that backdrop that the establishment of another constitutional reform and review exercise is to be seen against the backdrop of all the work done, the various starts and stops. Madam Speaker, it is, however, necessary that a review be conducted having regard to the passage of time since the recommendations were made in 1995 and the fact that amendments have been made to the Constitution over the years, and like I say, most significantly, the replacement of Chapter 3. Madam Speaker, again, because the Parliament is so differently constituted and not everyone is going to pick up the reports and read, I thought it important to summarise the recommendations as a way of updating the journey we have taken so far in the nation on this matter of constitutional reform. The Joint Select Committee on Constitutional and Electoral Reform recommended that a new constitution be drafted rather than amendments be made. Madam Speaker, you would recall that when I spoke in the sectoral debate and I indicated that it was the intention of this administration to look at a new constitution, many in the aftermath of the presentation equated that approach with delay. They, queried whether going for a new constitution meant that we were simply paying lip service to the work that needed to be done. And I understood the sentiment because so much had been done and so little had been implemented. And the work that had been done took a lot of time. But I'm pleased to say that it's not lip service that the administration is paying. We are serious about the constitutional reform work that remains to be done. So, Madam Speaker, the recommendation of that committee was for every chapter was reviewed with the aim of improving it. And the improvement was to be consistent with the transition of Jamaica from a constitutional monarchy to a republic. In Jamaicanizing the Constitution, it was recommended that Parliament enact a bill. At the time, it was said that it should be entitled the Jamaica Republic Act. Most importantly, the Jamaica Republic Act was to repeal the Jamaica Independence Act and for a formal diplomatic request to be made to the United Kingdom for the revocation of the enactments by the UK Parliament pertaining to the Jamaica Independence Constitution. While the Order of Council was not referred to specifically, it is, in fact, part of the enactments. In this regard, Madam Speaker, a bit of comparative assessment was done, and careful note has been and is to be taken of the process adopted by Trinidad and Tobago, for example, Mauritius, Kenya, and Barbados, most recently, in their transition to a republic. In all of these countries, the Order in Council was revoked by their parliament and the Independence Act repealed. It is interesting, Madam Speaker, to note the comments of the editors about the process adopted in Barbados. I quote, "In order to become a republic, the Barbados Parliament had to amend the Barbados Independence Order 1966. That required a two-thirds majority. Although some questioned whether this was possible, as an independent country, Barbados could amend or repeal any part of its statute book, including acts and orders passed by the UK Parliament before 1966. Madam Speaker, it should also be noted that whilst the approval of the UK Parliament, or Her Majesty in Council as it then was not required in order for the Barbados Parliament to revoke the Order in Council and repeal the Independence Act, it was necessary for the Parliament to pass a similar law to the one passed in Mauritius. Madam Speaker, it was necessary for some parliamentary work to be done. When Mauritius was transitioning, the UK Parliament passed a law, Madam Speaker, because the validity to deal with validity of laws. Madam Speaker, when Mauritius, speaking comparatively now, became a republic in 1992, the UK Parliament passed the Mauritius Republic Act. Section 1 of that Act affirmed that any relevant UK Act or instrument would continue to operate as if Mauritius had not become a republic. That situation is a little different from what obtains in Jamaica. The proposed Jamaica Republic Act was also recommended to include schedules containing the national anthem, the national songs for schools, the national motto, the national pledge, the national flag, and all the national symbols. It is again to be noted, as part of the background, that there were issues left unresolved by the Joint Select Committee on Constitutional and Electoral Reform. And these issues now require the attention of the committee that is to be named. For those who are inclined to take up the report of the Joint Select Committee, I would direct you to page 14 of the report. And that speaks to the selection of the President for the Republic. For those who are just tuning in, I am giving a background on the work that has been done so far on the constitutional reform front, and in particular, the recommendations that came out of the Joint Select Committee on Constitutional and Electoral Reform that was established at the time. At paragraph 48 of the report, it is reported that there was disagreement between the committee members as to whether the two-thirds majority should be obtained by a two-thirds majority of both houses voting together or by a two-thirds majority of each house voting separately. Just to say, Madam Speaker, that the recommendation had to do with the appointment of the President of the Republic of Jamaica and the process by which that appointment would be affirmed in the Parliament. The appointment of the President was recommended to be by the Prime Minister in consultation with the Leader of the Opposition, subject to parliamentary confirmation on a secret ballot by a two-thirds majority. But there was no agreement as to whether the two houses should meet together or each should meet separately, and that two-thirds vote taken. Secondly, Madam Speaker, the process by which presidential appointments are confirmed by Parliament, another part of the unfinished work. There was divided view as to whether the appointment should be deemed to be confirmed unless it is rejected by a two-thirds majority in favour of each house, or whether the confirmation should be by virtue of a two-thirds majority in favour in each house. So a little bit of it as to whether you should do negative or affirmative resolution, whether the houses should sit together or they should sit separately. There was also another matter regarding the method of appointing two Senate seats not appointed by the Prime Minister. For those who care to read, one of the recommendations was for an expansion in the Senate, and there were two seats in particular around which there was no disagreement, there was no agreement. So the method of appointing the two Senate seats not appointed by the Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition was not concluded, as there was no consensus on the approach to be taken to effect the appointment in relation to these seats. It's really interesting to see what the perspective was at the time. One approach was for a group contesting at least 50% of constituencies in a general election to appoint a senator for every 7.5% of the national vote secured by the group. Where neither of the two seats were able to be so appointed, it was suggested, or if only one, that the senators were to be shared equally between the two sides. Madam Speaker, some people may be a little lost. This work is extremely important. The Parliament and the people needs to be updated that what we are attempting to embark on, the road has been travelled many times. I just ask that everyone bear with me. If you haven't read it, if you are not familiar with constitutional reform, you may be wondering whether all of this detail is necessary, but it is necessary. And any question that arises in the presentation, please make a note, and I'll be happy to answer them at the end. Madam Speaker, there were also recommendations regarding the Public Service Commission, the Services Commission, the Constitutional Services Commission. The Public Service Commission was to be expanded in number, but there was disagreement around the process of appointing the existing number. In respect of Chapter 2 of the Constitution, there was recommendation in respect of every chapter. Chapter 2 deals with citizenship. It was recommended that this chapter should be expressed in simpler language. And I think that recommendation of expressing our laws in simple language is one that holds across the board, not only in respect of the Constitution as our supreme law, but in respect of every other piece of law that we have on our statute book. Interestingly, the recommendation was that the section empowering the deprivation of citizenship should be rescinded, as they said. And just to know that some of the reform has taken place in respect of this chapter. There was also provision should be made for children born to diplomatic officers serving overseas, and they were to be treated as having been born in Jamaica and to have their births registered in Jamaica. Madam Speaker, sometimes when we rehearse background on path taken in reform and we take for granted what we have now, people are alarmed about what the state of the law was at a particular time. The next chapter that was revised was Chapter 3. I won't say much on it because the Chapter 3 was replaced with the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedom. But although I will not say much, I must say that we will have to revisit Chapter 3. We will have to look at the wording of the chapter. There are some inconsistency in how the chapter is drafted. It is not about clawing back the rights, but it is about ensuring that the intention of Parliament is clear. And right now, that is not the state of affairs. Also, Madam Speaker, questions have arisen as to whether the Charter has gone too far in the extreme. And these are live questions that this Parliament will have to contend with. Madam Speaker, impeachment recommendations were also made. And I know this issue is topical. It is one that we will have to spend some time on to see what is the perspective. And I believe some guidance will also be given because we have learned much from our research in the ministry on impeachment provisions across jurisdictions. But suffice it to say, there was a recommendation that impeachment procedures be included with 4 main areas identified: definition of impeachable offences, identification of persons amenable to the process, the organization of the decision-making mechanism, and the procedure for the initiation and conduct of proceedings. Nothing has been implemented yet, but I know this matter is of interest. And I have to say, when the time comes, we will have to spend some time discussing this matter before we come to conclusions on it. Now to deal with the recommendations that are critical to the phase of constitutional reform that we will be dealing with. Chapter 4, this is the chapter dealing with the Governor General. The recommendations were made for the establishment of the office of President of the Republic of Jamaica as follows. The President is to be the head of state. Appointment should be by the Prime Minister in consultation with the Leader of the Opposition, subject to parliamentary confirmation. I spoke to that earlier when I indicated that there was no consensus reached on the process for the confirmation in the Parliament, and this will be part of the work that will go before the Constitutional Reform Committee. Discretionary power, it was recommended, is to be given to the head of state to make sensitive appointments without recourse to the Prime Minister. We will have to dig into that to see what was the thinking of the time, what it is that we would want to achieve with this. There was also a recommendation in respect of the power to appoint the Chief Justice, President of the Court of Appeal, members of the Judicial Service Commission, members of the Police Service Commission, the Public Defender, the Contractor General, and the independent members of the Electoral Commission. These appointments, it was recommended, were to be subject to parliamentary confirmation, but there was no consensus on the process. Since then, Madam Speaker, the Office of Contractor General has been subsumed in the Integrity Commission, and we have the Integrity Commission Act now being reviewed by a joint select committee of the Parliament. Interesting recommendations were made in respect of the Parliament itself, which is provided for at Chapter 5 of the Constitution. So the existing bicameral structure was recommended for retention, and by bicameral we mean the two houses here, the lower elected House of Representatives and the upper appointed Senate. Madam Speaker, it is most interesting that the Senate was recommended to be increased in size to 36 to facilitate the inclusion of wider interests from within the political parties and the wider society. The minds met to say 20 seats were to be appointed by the Prime Minister on the recommendation of, 14 on the recommendation of the Leader of Opposition, and 2 of wider interest to be appointed. And I did hear a little muttering when I spoke to those 2 seats, asking what was meant by that. It was recommended that Sections 69 and 70 be amended to limit members of the government who can hold executive office to be no more than 40% of the total number of parliamentarians and less than 50% of the members of each house. Most interesting recommendation that I believe much time will be spent discussing, especially when we look at what is currently in place and why it was put in place, and also comparatively assess what happens in other jurisdictions. Madam Speaker, moving to Chapter 6, which deals with the executive, the recommendation was for individuals and organizations to be empowered to challenge executive decisions. Quite interesting. It was also recommended that the Office of Parliamentary Secretary be replaced with a Deputy Minister, and that provision should be made for judicial review of the decisions of the Director of Public Prosecutions. And just to say how matters move forward when things stand still between recommendations and implementation, because since then and now, it is now settled law in this jurisdiction that the decisions of the Director of Public Prosecutions are subject to judicial review. And that did not arise as a result of any act of the Parliament, but as a result of decisions in the court. It was also recommended that provision should be made for the appointment of the Leader of the Opposition immediately following a general election, in a similar way that the Prime Minister is appointed, and there should be a prescribed oath for the Leader of the Opposition. Stands to reason the name of the Privy Council should be changed to the President's Council, but that the existing provisions for the prerogative of mercy should remain. And there was a recommendation that appointment of the the heads of the judiciary, Chief Justice and President, should be subject to parliamentary confirmation. It will be interesting to hear what views are shared on that in light of recent experience, to see what happens when that part of the state is open to political scrutiny. I think, Madam Speaker, what is clear to me is that many persons were looking on a model of government in an executive presidency without making the necessary comparison of what a Westminster-style government should be. Interestingly, Madam Speaker, the recommendation was for appeals to the UK Privy Council to continue subject to the introduction of the Caribbean Court of Justice. as of now, this is a matter that we will have to speak around and speak about, because I can tell you that views are divided. Views are divided. But these were the recommendations. You know, Madam Speaker, it was proposed that some offices were to be enshrined in the Constitution. Some of local government, for example, was to be put in the Constitution, and that was done in 2015. And I know the member, Brown Burke, is smiling because she played a role in that work, and Minister Mackenzie and others who have a passion for local government. But I should say that in discussing this matter, and I know both of you in particular may close your ears, but people are questioning whether in a jurisdiction like Jamaica we can afford to have two layers of government, local and central government, and how that impacts and affects the efficiency and effectiveness of government. Really, we will have to spend some time looking on what we have learned over the years since the recommendations were made, and know that we are ramping up the move to make the change. Madam Speaker, it was also recommended that the provisions of Section 49, the big bad Section 49, that is the section which speaks to alteration of the Constitution, that it should remain. However, it should be redrafted to make it more understandable. I pause here, Madam Speaker, because with Barbados moving so quickly to transition to a republic, many people have been wondering, why can't Jamaica do the same? Jamaica is not able to move in the same way because our big bad Section 49 provides for a very complex reform process for deeply entrenched provision, and ultimately the people must vote on the matter and have their say. No such provision exists in the Barbados Constitution. So with that long run-up, Madam Speaker, let me now focus attention on the way forward. I painted the picture just to let you know that the work is not starting from scratch. And in fact, we really have to commend those who worked and toiled in the field of constitutional reform in the past. Many have grown cynical and wondered whether they would see the ultimate change taking place. And many have lamented just the slow pace. But may I remind, for example, that the business of running government is very often occupied with important day-to-day happenings. When it was recommended that the Republic should have been enacted after the 2007 elections, in 2008, the world went into global recession, and just about every jurisdiction, every country had to deal with a serious bread and butter issue. So although the administration of Prime Minister Bruce Golding took the work forward substantially with the replacement of Chapter 3, when the administration was changed to the Simpson-Miller administration, much of the time was spent dealing with the legislative matters, but for fiscal discipline, dealing with the IMF program. And sometimes people don't understand the urgencies and emergencies that detain the Parliament. But here we are. So, Madam Speaker, the Ministry of Legal and Constitutional Affairs intends to deal with all the matters for which a referendum is constitutionally required first, as we move to implement outstanding recommendations on which consensus still remains, and on which, after further consideration, we would agree is still the way to go. I can tell you that we will have to revisit some of the recommendations because perspectives have changed, the experience of states have changed, threat to the states have changed. Some things that we're facing now were unimaginable in the time. And a lot has changed globally. So, Madam Speaker, I did say previously that when the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedom was enacted, replacing Chapter 3 as the first major constitutional reform work done, there should have been a comprehensive review of the laws of Jamaica to make them compliant with the Charter. That has not really been done, and the task now falls on the Ministry of Legal and Constitutional Affairs to exercise leadership across all of government to get that work done. And in fact, the new bail law is part of that review work. So, Madam Speaker, when Prime Minister Holness spoke in the budget debate earlier this year, he articulated the strategic imperative of his government, and he indicated clearly that on this issue of constitutional reform and the shift in Jamaica's status from a constitutional monarchy to a republic, it was agreed, and it was in his judgment, good judgment, that the approach must be collaborative and it must also be guided by expert advice. And it is with that direction and guidance and the stock-taking that has been done that the next Constitutional Reform Committee will be established. And the purpose of the committee, and let me just say that the time between my first announcement and now has allowed us to clarify what it is that this committee is to do to ensure that there is no time wasting. So the committee will be a consultative committee, a collaborative committee where we exchange perspectives, and insofar as the expert members in particular, but from everyone, that it provides some advice on the remaining work to be done and how the steps should be sequenced to implement those recommendations. Trust me, Madam Speaker and members, this will make the work a lot easier. I have heard many people say they have been asked to serve on committee and so much time has to be spent clarifying the work. Well, the time between then and now was used to clarify the work. Clarify the work. As I said, let me reiterate, the starting point will see a focus on matters on which there is consensus, starting with those matters that are deeply entrenched. That is where we're going to start. We're going to go, when we go to the people, the cost and the complexity of the process, we're not to be going back and forth. We're going to settle what it is that our founding fathers said, the people must have a say. It's not just up to those of us who are in the Houses of Parliament. So, Madam Speaker, the committee will note the constitutional reform work undertaken so far. My team and I have prepared background documents that will inform the work of the committee. We do not take it for granted that people know, and we are not going to send them through the task of digging into the archives and the library to get the work, but it is going to be critically important for every member to understand the journey we have taken so far. So those recommendations of the Joint Select Committee on Constitutional and Electoral Reform, as well as the recommendations of the Constitutional Commission, will be placed before the committee for them to note, for them to look on, and for perspectives to be exchanged on them. Madam Speaker, with the guidance of the Cabinet, and let me thank the Prime Minister for the guidance he also has provided, considering that he's not a lawyer, but takes great interest in matters of law. And I sometimes tease him that I think that he should actually, take on formal training in the law, because I'm always amazed at the perspective that he brings on some of the matters. But he always jokes and said, no way. But you can't escape some of it. Madam Speaker, I have found that the Prime Minister has a very clear mind on matters of law, and I very often tease him about that and ask him if he's sure he didn't undergo legal training. But just to say, Madam Speaker, the committee will comprise representatives from the government side of the Houses of Parliament and from the opposition side. I had written to the leader of the opposition. He wrote back to me. We spoke informally, and I'm to write back to him. But I have paid him the courtesy of keeping him abreast. I know he may not be very pleased that the pace has been what it has been. but I assure him and everyone else that the time has been well used, well used. The Attorney General will also sit on the committee. We will invite some constitutional law experts, including persons from academia, private sector, and the wider society. Broad-based committee. The committee will be supported by a secretariat led through the Ministry of Legal and Constitutional Affairs, and it will provide resources, because many persons are already in full-time work. And this is one of the things that I have heard. Sometimes committees are established and they are not able to work as they would like because they don't have the support staff, including for members of the Houses of Parliament who are not in government and are not backed by ministries, departments and agencies. So, Madam Speaker, the Secretariat will be drawn from the Ministry of Legal and Constitutional Affairs to include the Permanent Secretary, the Director of Legal Reform and a technical team, the Chief Parliamentary Counsel and a technical team, Senior Director of Constitutional Reform and a Recording Secretary. From the Ministry of Justice, Minister Chuck has had more than his fair share of dabbling in constitutional reform. The Attorney General's chambers, and in particular the Solicitor General and her team. Madam Speaker, the mandate of the committee has been clarified. The committee will review the Constitution of Jamaica against the backdrop of the work done, and all of that material will be provided. They will advise on the steps required to be taken to implement the recommendations that were approved and on which consensus remains. I can't repeat it too many times. We can never take for granted that the consensus arrived at one stage remains today, with the passage of time, with new perspectives, and so much more. And also, Madam Speaker, as part of that, therefore, the committee would opine on those recommendations and determine what remain. In respect of the Office of President in particular, we would share perspective on the establishment of the Office of President, advise on the nature of the presidency, qualification and tenure of the presidency, and also the staff and the resources that are required for the efficient functioning of the Office of President. So, Madam Speaker, scope of the work has also been defined. It's a long run-up, but I just want to assure everyone that the time has been well used. So the committee is expected to examine the provisions of the Order in Council, the Constitution of Jamaica, and the Jamaica Independence Act, identify provisions that will require amendment, if any, and give effect to the reform recommendations. The committee will also advise and make recommendations on the shift from a constitutional monarchy to the republic, including the type of republic, the necessary powers to address Jamaica's governance challenges, Madam Speaker. We will have to spend some time looking on this. It cannot be a mere cosmetic change. It cannot be, Madam Speaker. And also, we will do some comparative analysis by examining the process adopted by other constitutional monarchies that have transitioned to a republic. Trinidad and Tobago is right here, Kenya over in Africa, Mauritius, and more recently, Barbados. And we'd have to look at the nuances in the Jamaica Constitution. All the provisions of the constitutions of the Caribbean Commonwealth are not the same. As a second stage, a review of Chapter 3 will have to be done. This has some urgency around it, but we will put that work in the committee. And, Madam Speaker, some consultation will be done with experts. So in concluding, I'm pleased to advise the House and the nation that where we are now is that Cabinet has noted the extent of the constitutional reform work undertaken within the government of Jamaica over time and the matters on which bipartisan and broad consensus was reached, what was implemented and what remains to be done. And not to take tales out of school, we had an attentive audience as Cabinet noted, what was done, because there are new players and not many persons were around. Cabinet is now considering whether perspectives have changed with the passage of time on those matters on which consensus was previously reached, and I believe the committee will also have to consider that. Madam Speaker, the Cabinet has considered and approved the phased implementation of those matters on which consensus remains, starting with a change from a constitutional monarchy to the Republic of Jamaica and all the matters for which a referendum is constitutionally required. Cabinet has also approved, though that was not strictly required, but we will have some budget implications, for the establishment of the Constitutional Reform Committee that is to be constituted by the Minister of Legal and Constitutional Affairs for consultation, collaboration and advice on the work to be done. So, Madam Speaker, as I close, I want to say that I'm really pleased, after much labour behind the scene, that the groundwork has been properly laid and that the team we're now ready for implementation. I was reliably advised that the Leader of Opposition Business wrote a piece calling for an update. And I said to him, I had not seen the piece that he wrote. Surely you can't, surely the honourable members of the House can't believe that all of this work could have only come over the weekend. Not at all. But I think we're along the same line that, it was time for the update to be given. So, Madam Speaker, this is to say that I have had conversation with a number of persons who will form the committee. I will rewrite the Leader of Opposition to have him name his members, Madam Speaker, and it is my hope that the committee will be announced in December, before we close off, and that we will set the period for deliberation and that the bill will come. I must say, Madam Speaker, that I was amused to see how many times the work had started. There are at least 2 draft bills across administrations on the Republic of Jamaica. The Leader of Opposition, when he was in the role of Minister of Justice, he took a submission to the Cabinet. That submission, with the permission of Cabinet, may be released, and the decision to show just how many times the work had started and stopped. But to say to the nation that we are moving ahead, and all things being equal, the nation may be surprised how soon a bill comes to the Parliament. Madam Speaker, I cannot hide my excitement. Let me just say before I take my seat that not all of the matters that people have interest in will be dealt with in the first phase. I can say up front now, as of now, there is no consensus on the final court at this time. I know it is a matter of particular interest, but we do not want those matters on which there is no consensus and for which there is no requirement for a referendum to delay the work. Let us get on with it. The committee will be pleased to see, when the background material is placed before it, just how much work has been done between January, the time when the ministry was created, and now, and the clarity that we have gained on what we need to achieve. Madam Speaker, it is my hope that when we shall have done the work, it will provide a reset for Jamaica. Lord knows that we cannot continue with a level of lawlessness and disorder and chaos, with a level of grievance that have come to characterize the society. We do need a reset. We're a people destined for greatness, and we have seen glimpses, pockets of excellence. We want to mainstream excellence in the culture of Jamaica. I so look forward to the next stage, Madam Speaker. I hope that the Parliament is duly updated, and the next time I speak, it will be to announce the formal constitution of the Constitutional Reform Committee. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Opposition Leader. Thank you, Minister Malahoo Fort. Opposition Leader.
Thank you, Madam Acting Speaker. When I came to Parliament today, I wasn't expecting to be responding to a statement, a fulsome statement on constitutional reform. It wasn't on the agenda. An agenda was set up to sent to us up to this morning. The only item on that agenda was a statement by the Minister of Finance. Apparently, we're not having that statement, but we're having two other statements which were not on the agenda. I fail to see why this was not on the agenda, given, as the Minister has said, that this is obviously something that she's been working on for some time. Anyway, it is what it is. Madam Speaker, what the Minister has described is a major exercise in review with a view to major reforms. This is a process which, as has been said, has been undertaken in the past extensively. Many years were spent on reviewing our Constitution, distilling the issues around which there were consensus, producing reports which were ultimately brought to Parliament, put before joint select committees, reviewed. The joint select committee issued reports itself, and out of that process came the Charter of Rights. There are other things which were agreed at the time, which, because the process involves a referendum, in particular the changing of the head of state of the country, that has always been a more difficult one to digest for a government, because Jamaica's experience with referenda is limited, and the one referendum of which I'm aware was in 1961. The government of the day lost the referendum and lost the election that followed thereafter. So I think incumbent governments have been somewhat coy about embarking on a referenda. But it has to be done because the Constitution in Section 49 specifies that one of the provisions which cannot be amended without a process which involves the legislation, the amending legislation, passing through Parliament with a two-thirds majority support of both houses, followed by a referendum with majority support of the voters who voted on the referendum, includes the provision that has the British monarch as our head of state. So we have to have a referendum to change that. Fortunately, we are aware, based on the visit of Prince William earlier this year, that the Prime Minister has indicated we will be moving on. This is something we have wanted to do for some time, as was said by the Minister when I was last in the Cabinet in the 2012 to 2016 government. I brought a submission to Cabinet detailing the amendments that would need to be made in order to move to a republic. At the time, the decision, because we were committed to also moving away from the Privy Council to the Caribbean Court of Justice, we decided to sequence the events with dealing with the CCJ first. That legislation was brought here. The two-thirds majority approved it in the lower house, but in the Senate we could not get the then opposition support, and it never proceeded any further. And by that time, the 4-year to 5-year term of that government was virtually at an end. And the next step was never embarked on, though the preparatory work had been done. Madam Speaker, we on this side feel very strongly that Jamaica needs to complete the decolonization process. As a proud nation, it is really a travesty that 60 years after so-called independence of 1962, which is essentially achieving self-government, we have not been able to actually achieve full sovereignty. And there are two main elements which are outstanding there. One is affects the judicial branch, which is that our final court, our highest court, is not a Jamaican court. It's not a Caribbean court. It's the Privy Council in England. That was established around the time of the emancipation from slavery back in the 1830s. It is a British institution, a colonial institution, and it remains our final court. The issue of access to justice is critical because the costs of litigating matters in London before the Privy Council are prohibitive and way out of reach of the ordinary Jamaican citizen. Furthermore, Jamaica has reached the point where, in order to travel to the United Kingdom as a Jamaican citizen, you require a visa, which you don't have a right to. It is a discretionary matter for the UK government whether or not you get a visa. And it cannot be right that we remain with a final court in a jurisdiction which we have no right of access to. The irony of the situation is that the idea of having a final regional court was first foreshadowed by the Jamaica Labour Party government under Hugh Shearer, who called for it in the early 1970s or late 1960s. I think it was the early 1970s. And it was recognized then that we had had a federal court of appeal under federation, which was a very successful and highly regarded court. And it was felt that we ought to be moving in that direction. We have the University of the West Indies. We had West Indies cricket, which for many years was an institution of great pride for the Caribbean. In recent times, it hasn't been as favorable in terms of its outcomes, but nevertheless, the point is that a regional institution was from then regarded as desirable to establish a final court. Significant work was done to develop the parameters of that court to ensure judicial independence by establishing a regional judicial services commission which appoints the judges to the CCJ, financial independence by establishing a trust fund that would, through the income earned on the fund, cover the operating and capital expenditures of that court without resort to the budgets of the regional governments. And the way that trust fund was set up was that each CARICOM state borrowed the funds representing its share of that trust fund, put the borrowed funds into the trust fund, and then paid off the loans. So that trust fund is fully established. The loans have been repaid. Jamaica contributed our proportionate share to that. Over the 15 years since the CCJ was established, the jurisprudence of the court has been acknowledged generally and internationally as excellent. Its judicial independence is unquestioned and beyond doubt, and it has won accolades and awards for excellence as a judicial institution. It uses audiovisual procedures extensively so that litigants do not have to travel to where it is sitting in order to participate in court proceedings. They can stay right where they are and do that, significantly reducing the costs of litigating cases before the CCJ. And where it is warranted, the rules of the court provide for it to travel and hear matters in jurisdictions across the Caribbean, as indeed it did in the Shanique Myrie case, where the court came to Jamaica to hear from the Jamaican witnesses in that case. And of course, in that case, which was not a final court of appeal case, because Jamaica doesn't have the CCJ as its final court, but was to do with the Treaty of Chaguaramas and the interpretation and application of that treaty, that matter was heard before the CCJ in that jurisdiction, and Ms. Myrie and Jamaica were successful in that case. So we feel that the judicial branch of government ought to be decolonized as part of this exercise, and that Jamaica should adopt the CCJ as our final court of appeal and cut ties with the monarch's Privy Council in the United Kingdom, which is fundamentally inaccessible, both from the point of view of the requirement of a visa to travel to the UK to participate in the proceedings, and from the point of view of costs, which are prohibitive and out of reach for the average Jamaican citizen. So we reiterate our call for the government to get on board with this, with us, and let us do this together. Let us decolonize Jamaica once and for all. The other aspect of that is, of course, the executive branch and the matter of the head of state. The Prime Minister told Prince William publicly that Jamaica would be moving on when he visited us, when, was it in February this year? And we were pleased to hear the Prime Minister say this, because we were aware that he had just recently joined Her Majesty's Privy Council as a Privy Councillor. So we weren't quite sure what his commitment was in terms of the decolonization of Jamaica. But he made the statement, and he has subsequently said more on it. And we're pleased to see the direction there. And we fully support this. We would like to see both the executive and judicial branches decolonized together. One procedure, the one for the judicial aspect of it, moving from the Privy Council, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London, to the CCJ, does not require a referendum. It can be done by legislation which is approved by a 2/3 majority of both houses. And the government is assured of the support of the opposition in relation to that. So that can be done once the government makes a decision that it wants to do it. On the other aspect of it, which is the monarchy, it requires a referendum. And again, they know that we support Jamaica moving to having a Jamaican head of state. We've said it time and time again. We did the legal work when we were in government to prepare for it, so they are assured of that. But we would like to see both things done together. Obviously, they won't be synchronized exactly because the procedures are slightly different, but the legislation can be brought here together, and we can proceed with the parliamentary aspect of it together, and then the referendum aspect of it, which is relevant for the executive, for the head of state change, that would follow thereafter. I don't have any objection to going through another deep dive into constitutional reform. However, I really feel that that should not be a pretext or a basis for slowing up the process of actualizing the commitments that have been given to the Jamaican people for us to move away from being a country run by the British monarchy or under the jurisdiction of the British monarchy and having a Jamaican head of state. I am extremely disappointed that we are now in mid-November and the Ministry of Legal and Constitutional Affairs was constituted at the beginning of 2022, and we still have so little output from that ministry to move us forward. We have a statement by Minister in November indicating where they intend to go. We still don't have legislation before us to start the time frame which is prescribed in the Constitution for this type of reform, which requires a specific period of time for it to be tabled before it can be debated, and thereafter to be debated. And overall in the lower house, it's a 6-month minimum period. So I'm distressed that this is taking so long, and I've said it before. I wrote to the minister on the 3rd of June in reply to her letter asking me to nominate persons to sit on this committee, asking her to clarify exactly where this committee would be going, because I was concerned about, first of all, what was going to be done in relation to the final Court of Appeal and what the government's current position on that is. And also, when I heard that one of the things they intend to do is to review the Charter of Rights, that also is a matter of grave concern to me. The Charter of Rights is the most recent substantive amendment to the Constitution other than enshrining local government in the Constitution. The Charter of Rights was developed out of an extended process of consultation and input from the broader society, and it enjoyed the support of both sides of the aisle. Its provisions are before the court in a number of areas and have been the subject of judicial pronouncements in other areas. I am of the view that we ought to allow it to mature and let that jurisprudence develop further rather than seeking to tinker with it, especially when I know that this government has a predilection for procedures like the state of emergency as a routine policing tool, and the minister herself, when she was Attorney General, spoke to the need to abrogate and abridge people's rights. So I'm concerned about seeking to reintroduce into this process, in the early stage of the life of the Charter, a review of the Charter. I don't see the necessity for that. But also I noticed that she said, the minister says that in her summary of what Cabinet has approved, she's indicated that consider the phased implementation of those matters on which consensus remains, starting with the change from a constitutional monarchy to the Republic of Jamaica. And then it says, and all matters for which a referendum is constitutionally required.
Member Jackson, if you shout across the aisle while your leader is speaking, but that doesn't help. You're encouraging noise while your leader speaks. Members, please allow the leader of the opposition to complete his statement. In quiet.
I notice it says not only is it going to address the change from a constitutional monarchy to the Republic in this first phase, but all other matters, all matters for which a referendum is constitutionally required. Now, if you look in the Constitution and in Section 49, which is a provision that governs how you amend the Constitution, the provisions that require a referendum are they cover a lot of different issues. For example, it includes the way in which the Senate is constituted, the way in which the House is constituted. Those are deeply entrenched provisions, and there are several others. If we are going to seek to take to a referendum all of those issues on which I dare say there is going to be a challenge to reach consensus on all of them in the short term, we are going to delay the process of decolonization in an unacceptable way. So I urge the Prime Minister, please, Prime Minister, get this thing back on track. Let us deal with the decolonization issue, which is the burning issue, which is what led you to speak in the terms you did when you spoke to Prince William when he visited you, saying we were moving on. We support that. The only difference is that we just want to not only decolonize the hell of state, but we want to decolonize access to justice for our people by moving to the CCJ. And that move is supported up until, as far as I know, to the present day, by the Bar Association of the country and by many other members of civil society. And indeed, as I've said, there's every reason to support it based on the fulsome track record of the CCJ as a court and the very careful way in which it was established to ensure its independence, both financial and otherwise. It's the way in which it is buffered from political independence. Madam Speaker, the last point I want to make is on the impeachment bill. Former Prime Minister Bruce Golding tabled an impeachment bill, I think it was in 2010. It was never debated. The Jamaica Labour Party, in their manifesto for the 2016 election, committed to introducing impeachment legislation. In the course of this year, or the last 12 months anyway, things have happened which indicate the need for that procedure to exist so that there can be some accountability for the aberrant behavior of parliamentarians that bring their office into disrepute. I looked at that bill and made some minor adjustments to it, but important adjustments, and tabled it this year, I believe it was, in here. And I'm calling on the Prime Minister to assist with the process by sending that bill to a joint select committee so it can be reviewed fulsomely with the benefit of input from the wider society. It is a very important piece of legislation. It is a legislation which in principle the government is committed to, in its own manifesto, and we endorse the need for it in this present time. The opposition does not have the required votes to send it to a joint select committee on our own. The government can block it by inaction. But I'm asking them not to do so. I'm asking them to embrace it. I'm not saying it's perfect. That's why I want to send it to a joint select committee. But I would like that process to begin, and I'm asking the Prime Minister to facilitate the sending of that bill to a joint select committee for a fulsome, wide-ranging review, so we can finally have a procedure which involves the accountability of members of the Senate and of the House who behave in a way unbecoming of their office, bringing the parliamentary system into disrepute. Madam Speaker, as I said, I did not come here prepared to speak to this issue today. It was not on the agenda, and I must use this opportunity to say how frustrating it is that we are sent agendas frequently up to the day of the hearing, which turn out to be inaccurate. And today is the most egregious case, because the one item that was on the agenda that was sent to us today is in fact not proceeding, and instead there are two other items which are proceeding, which were not on the agenda. One of them, which was clearly something the result of significant work by the minister, and I cannot understand why it was not on the agenda for today, but it wasn't. Madam Speaker, we must run our affairs in a more efficient, transparent way than that. Thank you.
Madam Minister.
Madam Speaker, the opposition leader has acknowledged that significant work has been done. Just to say that this significant work will mean that when the committee is formally constituted, it can move at a faster pace. I heard many things being said, and it appears to me that the opposition intends to tie the issues and perhaps would not be prepared to support the reform unless... Hold on.
Madam Speaker, on a point of order, and just to clarify, I have not said that we intend to tie the issues in the sense that we wouldn't proceed with one without the other. What I have said, it is our preference and what we regard as the right approach for both to move forward concurrently. And that is what we would like to see the government embrace. We have never said that we wouldn't support one unless the other is brought at the same time. We haven't said that, so please don't suggest it.
Madam Speaker, be assured that I was merely speaking to what I heard, but I do welcome the clarification, because what was said left me in little or no doubt. But I welcome the clarification. And let me just say, Madam Speaker, that on the issue of matters for which there is no consensus, we cannot afford to go down the road that the opposition, when it was in government, went down. Because given its passion for the issue, understandably so, it sequenced the reform step by placing the bill for the judicial branch first. It did not yield the result. So regardless of where we stand on the issue, I think there is some wisdom to be derived and some lessons to be learned from attempts in the past. And if your complaint is about the pace of the reform and not delaying it, then it would stand to reason that we shouldn't disagree to proceed on the matters where there is consensus. You know, Madam Speaker, I am not surprised that the issue of the final court will evoke a lot of concern. And I think the biggest lesson has to be learned with the attempt to put in the CCJ. We can't afford it because, as you've rightly said, we're paying for a court in its appellate jurisdiction that we're not using. The approach, the appellate jurisdiction that we are not using, the approach taken then was so wrong, and we cannot make the same errors of the past. And the leader of opposition may have given the impression that the issue of the final court is an easy one, but it is not. If it were as easy as he's making it out, then the jurisdiction in which the seat of the court is located would have long acceded to its appellate jurisdiction. We have also had other jurisdictions that put the issue to the people and they did not get the vote in a referendum. So it is not a simple matter. It is not a simple matter. Philosophically, it may appear so on one level. But let us talk frankly and truthfully to the people of Jamaica. It is not as simple as that. But here is where there is no disagreement between your views and mine and the leadership that I would exercise in sharing. It is utterly offensive for there to be a visa requirement for Jamaicans to access their final court. Utterly. I take umbrage to it. And the question, Madam Speaker, since coming into the post of minister in this ministry, I have had conversations in the highest place in London on this matter. I have raised the issue in the highest place. And I think there is no doubt in certain quarters what my views are for this jurisdiction on that matter. But like I say, it is absolutely unacceptable for us to have to get a visa to access our final court. I think the requirement of the visa for the court, I will yield shortly, was wrongly situated in the immigration policy of the UK. This is a matter of access to justice. But visa issues are not simple. They're not simple. And on this matter, it would involve the Secretary of Justice, the Secretary for Home Affairs, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And conversation is taking place. As a matter of fact, now that the issue has been raised, let me just say that the Parliament may be agreed, but the people may not be, as other jurisdictions have shown. Right? And we will have to have a conversation in the unlikely event that when we go to the people, we do not get the vote. It is my hope that the two sides of the aisle will go unitedly to the people. But let me just say, Madam Speaker, polls have been done, views have been solicited, and there can be no foregone conclusion. We may criticize all we want about what could tie the minds of people to not want to go. So we will also have to have a conversation with His Majesty's government, because the provision at 49 of the Constitution is a provision that was passed at the court of Buckingham Palace with the input of our fathers of the nation. And I think the biggest indictment, I must say, now that focused attention is being given to our constitution and our form of government, that in all the years we have not had the kind of engagement that should be had about what it means to be part of the Commonwealth realm, and the kind of policies that the monarchist government of the United Kingdom would devise in respect of countries who share the monarch as head of state. And even as we embark on this work, it is a conversation that we will have to have. Because God forbid, if we go to the referendum and the people say, you know what, this is not my issue right now. England not doing nothing. It is up to us. And we are stuck with a constitutional monarchy. We will have to have conversations of what that means. But that was the wisdom of our forefathers, our founding fathers. Hide it so deep and bury it so deep that it can't be easily changed. So the matters are not easy. They're not easy. But one thing can be sure is that we are going ahead, and the time has been used to do the deep dive. The committee will not be asked to do that deep dive. The materials will be placed before it, because you see, Madam Speaker, it is the government of the day that brings a bill to the Parliament. So the government of the day must give some indication of what it is seeking to achieve. I'm just going to respond very briefly before I take my seat to some other comments made. Madam Speaker, I don't expect everyone to cheer on, but this is not the juncture for us to become despondent about the work that we're embarking on. It really is not, because, like I say, not many persons in this Parliament would have known how much work was done. Not everybody is a lawyer, and even the lawyers, they do not have access to the files of government to know what was there. And even those who may have an interest may find it way too laborious to dig into the decades and decades of past to get the information. The work has been done by the Ministry of Legal and Constitutional Affairs and will be made available for everyone to see. So work has been taking place to simplify and clarify. When you are charged with responsibility to exercise leadership, you must lead, and especially if you have training and expertise in the area, you must guide. You know, Madam Speaker, much has been said about tinkering with rights. And let me just say, no, there is no ouch for me. Because when I take a position in principle, and I can always be persuaded by reason. When I made the statement about infringing and abrogating rights, I did speak to the derogation standard where it is demonstrably justified. I did say that. And if you go back and look on the clip, you will see it. But it's been convenient for many to stop it there. But you know, thank God for the age of technology. I did say that. And anyone who is going to criticize a statement like that, especially one who is learned in the law, should really just step back and pause and say, if the Constitution allows it, then it can be done. My statement respected the constitutional provision, though many have chopped it. So don't tell me that you respect constitutional supremacy, and when we move to use a provision of the Constitution, you cry foul. Utter nonsense. In fact, it's schizophrenic. So I am unapologetic when I say Madam Speaker, you see, because I like research, Madam Speaker.
Hold a moment, please, Madam Minister. I would hope that the opposition afford you the same respect that you are called on to afford them. May I have silence in the House, please?
You know, Madam Speaker, it's only because a lot of Jamaicans are not prepared.
Member, please. Member, would you like to turn on your mic with that conversation, Member Brownberg? I can hear you very clearly.
On a point of order, Madam Speaker, if you can hear me loudly, then I don't need to repeat it now, do I?
Oh, you could repeat it for Hansard. You're being very rude. You are being very rude. You are being very rude. Shame on you.
Madam Speaker, you know what? Madam Speaker, if I were mean-spirited, as many on that side in particular are, yes, on this issue of constitutional reform, you see, we don't like to speak truth, you know, because the impression has been given that the Andrew Holness administration has not given due care and attention to matters of the Constitution. Well, you know what I'm going to bring? I am going to bring, Madam Speaker, a record of how many times the full court has ruled unconstitutional legislation passed, including under the government in which many were a part of. Matters that are now before the Privy Council in relation to proceeds of crime. Matters in relation to an attempt to effect accession to the CCJ, going as far back as the gun court. Every government has had to deal with challenges to the constitutionality of laws passed. And I can tell you, the record is not the biggest for the Andrew Holness administration. And you don't have to take my word. Go look for anybody who wants to research it. So when we who are supposed to have better sense start talking about things because it may suit us partisanly, we mislead the people. Madam Speaker, even when the Leader of Opposition was Minister of Justice and was chairman of the Legislation Committee of the Cabinet that he was part of, legislation passed under his watch were struck down by the court. The one that has the Bar Association, no, that is before the court. All right? Madam Speaker? Madam Speaker? Legislation come in different form. At the very top, you have the Constitution, then you have the Acts of Parliament, and you have regulations down the line.
Members.
I don't wish for this to descend, Madam Speaker. All I want the people of Jamaica to know is that
members, opposition leader,
the courts,
Minister, I would really like to hear the minister speak. I listened very quietly. The members listened very quietly to the opposition leader, and I'm asking you to pay due respect and do the same so that the minister may complete her response.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My simple point is that we must lift the people. The courts have to do their role, and it is the function of the courts to review laws passed by the Parliament. And it is the function of the courts to decide whether the laws passed, in form and in substance, whether they are consistent with the Constitution. So, Madam Speaker, you know, we must exercise leadership responsibly. The last thing I will say in respect of the concern expressed by the Leader of the Opposition about the issues that should go to the people. There are not many issues that are listed for referendum. They are not. They are set out there. So, for example, the recommendation that Section 49 itself be simplified, that has to go to the people. All right? It is going to be, Madam Speaker, a matter of how you design the ballot. All right? And there are many lessons to be learned. And that's why we're going to have experts in practice and in theory that will help to guide the work, with whom I've been having discussion. So, it is how you design your ballot at the end of the day. And in a population like Jamaica, I can tell you that we will go with a simple ballot, which will require a yes or a no. There are many experts in the field of designing ballots for the referendum. So it shouldn't be said and mislead the people that if you deal with all of the issues for which we require a referendum, it's going to confuse the people. No such thing. Simply a matter of how the ballot will be designed. Simply a matter of how the ballot will be designed. The fact that you proceeded with one leg that you felt should have happened and it didn't happen, let's not sour grape the thing, man. Let's move forward. I mean, the Prime Minister didn't rearrange his government just so. It is his intention to get it done, and we will get it done. We will get it done. So, Madam Speaker, let me return to the more upbeat note. I am very pleased with the progress that has been made so far in this area. And when the committee is named, they will realize that they will be greatly aided and that they will be guided in terms of what will be done. And all things remaining equal, Madam Speaker, we may have a bill sooner than many expect. When I gave a timeline in my sectoral presentation, and I said it was terribly ambitious, terribly ambitious. Many said they didn't think that it could happen. But I can tell you, with where we are now, it is highly likely but I don't know whether anything else will intervene. And there are many other conversations that we must have, but the work is going forward. And I hope it won't be a begrudging that one side gets done what we have all agreed to do, but we're not able to get done before. All right? So, Madam Speaker, I hope the people have been informed. I don't know why the leader of opposition is bickering so much. I expect cooperation. Cooperation. You can't give with one hand telling how pleased you are and you're calling for it and know that you're going to get it, then you're going to pull it back. No, man, that comes across in a mean-spirited way. I don't think that's what you intend, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. House Leader. House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The next statement is from the Minister of Health and Wellness, Minister Tufton.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, I actually have, through you, two very brief statements. So I'll begin with a statement, and they should be circulated. The mic is on. Are you not hearing me? No?
No. I'm hearing.
Are you hearing me?
I'm hearing. Yes, hearing now.
Okay.
Minister, are you splitting up the two statements by Minister?
That's entirely up to you, Madam Speaker, but they are brief. The first one on code care, I would begin with, and then you can determine if I should do otherwise. So, Madam Speaker, the Ministry of Health and Wellness is now developing and implementing different strategies and programs to manage the impact of the post-COVID-19 pandemic, something that we have discussed in these chambers. Some of these issues include the increasing cases of mental health, the growing concerns around long COVID, and the growing need for human resources by our major trading partners and the resulting high movement of labor to meet those needs, as well as the myriad of maintenance issues related to infrastructure and equipment that are now more prevalent. Madam Speaker, as the government, we have developed interventions aimed at arresting the challenges with mental health through varied involvement within the community and schools. We are now further developing the strategies to deepen the community mental health program, and through partnerships with the Pan American Health Organization have launched our support to the educational community. And we have started that intervention, Madam Speaker. I've been in many schools with the Psychological Association, the Psychiatry National Association, that group. Dr. Sapphire Longmore, Senator, who has been a part of that, has been providing some critical support, working with the ministry. And a lot more will be said of that support, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, COVID-19 has also resulted in significant issues related to the provision of elective surgeries, which is where I want to focus briefly today. These are procedures that are non-emergency, that while not being immediately life-threatening, can have significant impact on the quality of life of persons. Many of these persons who require these procedures are placed on waiting lists that are rescheduled once there is an emergency. And Madam Speaker, colleagues, in our health infrastructure hospitals, there is always an emergency, which means many of these procedures keep being pushed back. That situation was amplified with the COVID pandemic. Many of these, as such, many patients wait for years to receive badly needed intervention. An assessment of the waiting list for patients needing elective surgeries showed that over 7,000 persons are awaiting elective surgeries, with a vast majority waiting for more than 2 years, in some instances as long as 4 years and even beyond. Madam Speaker, in my sectoral presentation in April 2022, I highlighted the challenges that are bound to escalate as we tackle this particular task. The presentation spoke to the need for innovation based on the staff shortages and positioned the idea of utilizing the diaspora to assist with these challenges through what we term the code care intervention. The idea was to utilize the goodwill in the diaspora and to encourage philanthropic efforts through the give back of skills, and in particular operating theater nurses where there is a shortage. The presentation also posited the idea of utilizing different forms of work arrangements where healthcare workers can work in other countries for periods of time and retain their engagement in the public system, thereby providing persons who are contemplating migration a possible option. Important to just explain this for 10 seconds. Madam Speaker, more often than not, the huge demand for our nurses, and in particular our specialist nurses, pulls them from Jamaica into the developed world, North America, Canada, and also in recent times more so in the UK, or to the UK. We believe, having assessed the situation, that many of these professionals, if they had an option based on salary scale and other critical conditions of work, would choose to stay in Jamaica. And because there are no options, they either stay or they go, they opt to go. And so one of the innovations that we have been thinking through and trying to work through is to give them that option by allowing for some flexi contracts coming out of the collaboration under this code care arrangement. So, Madam Speaker, the code care intervention sought to leverage the capacities also of the private sector and to give access to care to public sector patients. This modality has been used on many other jurisdictions and have been shown to be effective in not only reducing the backlog, but also bolster the quality of care by reducing the patient load in the public sector. Again, Madam Speaker, we're operating on the principle that there should be one health and no distinction between public and private. And where the private has spare capacity and the public is under stress, which is more often than not, we can transfer some of that capacity or demand from the public to the private under special arrangements. And that is captured under the Public-Private Partnership Initiative. And we have applied that in this case to clear out the backlog of surgeries. So, Madam Speaker, over 170 patients have been to date removed from the waiting list for elective surgeries, many of whom have been waiting for over 4 years. We started with the longest waits. This number also includes approximately 35 children who received surgeries for ear, nose, and throat procedures at the Bustamante Hospital for Children. The Ministry of Health and Wellness has successfully signed also under this public-private partnership arrangement 8 agreements with private institutions for the delivery of over 500 surgeries, which we anticipate will take place over the next 10 months. Could be more depending on the pace and depending on what we are able to do within the public system to clear up this backlog. Also, Madam Speaker, a total of $950 million has been allocated to the project, with the vast majority of funding going to the renovation and upgrading of 9 operating theaters in 4 hospitals. These upgrades will enable the local surgery staff to do more and to enhance the throughput of surgeries within hospitals. To date, the teams have begun the process of developing the estimates for the renovation of the facilities, and the Ministry will utilize emergency procedures where possible to effect the works that are urgently required on these facilities. This is an important point because what it means is that we are not just depending on the diaspora relations, we're not just depending on the outsourcing through public-private arrangements, we're also looking at renovating and upgrading our own public sector operating theaters, and quite a sum has been allocated to that. Unfortunately, that process takes a longer time than the previous arrangements that I mentioned earlier. In total, Madam Speaker, we are hoping to remove some 2,000 persons from the surgery backlog and provide them with health services that improve their quality of life. Madam Speaker, the Ministry is also pleased to announce, again as part of this mission or this initiative, that on December 1st to 6th, 2022, our first overseas mission will arrive in the country, consisting of 6 nurses and 1 anesthesiologist from the US, the United States of America. And the team will work with their local counterparts at the Noel Holmes Hospital in Hanover, where the surgery list will attempt to cover over 30 patients. So we will pre-plan those procedures. There is a minor operating theater at the Noel Holmes Hospital, and that team will go specifically to that location and spend a period of time, normally about 5 days or so, to try and deal with those cases. Some of the procedures that will be undertaken in the first mission includes hernia, hysterectomy, and Thorpe surgeries. Madam Speaker, as a part of addressing the post-COVID challenges, we have embarked on a strategic shift in the approach to healthcare delivery. As part of this shift, a greater focus is placed in developing and structuring strategic partnerships to enhance the universal access ideals to which this government has ascribed. Accordingly, 2 agreements have been signed. These agreements coming on the heels of my visit, my tour of duty to the US, where we visited about 6 health systems. 2 agreements have been signed, one with the University of Miami, the other with Hartford Health System, to mitigate the training and staffing challenges that we face. As part of the overall approach, these agreements will seek to create opportunities for training and development, but more importantly, to examine the possibilities for addressing the challenges of human resources for health. The MOUs that have been signed opens the door for greater collaboration in technology and enhanced use of telemedicine for the delivery of healthcare and the training of specialists within the sector. The discussions coming on the MOUs have started. A proposed or draft joint training course outline have been developed, and the idea is to train our first batch of specialist nurses jointly by these institutions. So in one case it will be between the government and the University of Miami Health System. In another case between government and Hartford Health System. What does this joint training mean? An agreed course outline, sharing of faculty, the possibility of sharing of clinical rotation. So some of those, there may be a case for the nurses to go to those systems and work in those hospitals to rotate around the practical component of the training, and the use of technology through simulation, at the end of which they will qualify to work both in Jamaica but also in the US or in those respective jurisdictions based on the state's governance structure for that practice. And we hope that the possibility would exist for some sort of flexible arrangement. I do envision, Madam Speaker, colleagues, that there's going to come a point when a nurse, and a specialist nurse in particular, would be able to work in one jurisdiction for 5 months, in another jurisdiction for 7, hopefully more time here in Jamaica. Because I am of the view that the nurse, the Jamaican nurse, would prefer to reside in Jamaica, in their home country. It is more about economics, and if they have the opportunity to do both, I believe it would be a good middle ground, and of course it would benefit both jurisdictions. Madam Speaker, we as a government are seeking to restore the systems that are necessary for the provision of quality service within the public sector. Ministry of Health and Wellness recognizes its role and its commitment, but we also recognize that the environment has changed significantly, and we need to look at new and innovative ways, and this is part of that analysis and part of the dispensation that we're moving towards. Our post-COVID work, however, must ensure that we learn from the experiences, that we create greater resilience in our health system, our infrastructure, and our people, and that we utilize new ways, which means challenging the traditional ways, to build greater capacity, even if it means that that capacity is shared. Because at the end of the day, Madam Speaker, one thing that COVID has proven to us is that nowhere is safe if parts of us are safe and other parts are unsafe. A rising tide lifts all boats. Madam Speaker, we believe that the approach that Code Care as a new initiative is taking based on the work of our ministry, the regional authorities, our partners, and the diaspora included, we will see us addressing the backlog of surgeries and enhancing the overall resilience and response to our healthcare needs. Thank you, Madam Speaker. That's the first statement.
Thanks, Minister. Will the member from St. Mary Central respond?
Relax. Thank you much, Madam Speaker. Minister, I want to thank you for the statement that you have just tabled and read. The concern that has always existed is the state of the health sector in Jamaica. And we know that you have indicated that as part of the program that $950 million has been allocated for the repair of the operating theaters and other infrastructure in the hospitals, part of it. What is interesting though, Minister, you did indicate in your statement that it takes a longer time to do this, and you're comparing it with the diaspora engagement. But isn't it a fact that you have only been in receipt of monies to do that, the $950 million as spoken for in the second supplementary estimate, where the amounts that have been, allocated or reallocated for that particular program. So we would have wanted to see a situation where both of them would have worked together, because you will agree, Minister, that our doctors and nurses who remain here, who work in the system, are excellent physicians and excellent nurses. And if they are given the resources, i.e. the proper operating theaters, well-equipped operating theaters, and the other things that come with it, then certainly they would be able to do a good job. I'm happy to note that a significant number of persons within the sector who have been waiting on surgeries will be facilitated as a result of this. I have a few questions, Minister. And the first one is that you have indicated that you have signed 8 agreements with private institutions for delivery of over 500 surgeries. Can you itemize those? Because in the last series of questions, the names of them. The last series of questions I asked which were those, and there were only 2 in Montego Bay which were part of this. Secondly, the matter of the nurses who are going to be working at Noel Holmes Hospital, as well as others who will come in. We recognize that a significant part of them will be Jamaicans who have lived abroad and are coming back. Can we ensure that the matter of registration with the local nursing council is facilitated so that they don't have problems in terms of being recognized? I see where your technocrats have given you an additional H, or a H in terms of the type of surgery that will be performed. But it's a TURP as opposed to a THURP, but c'est la vie. At Noel Holmes, you said hernias, hysterectomy, TURP surgeries. I said they give you an extra H or additional H, which wasn't necessary there. But that's your technocrats. TURP, yes, meaning transurethral resection of the prostate, which you might want to do a little later on. Everything. Minister, one other thing. The matter with the operating theaters, and you also mentioned the public-private partnerships. Public-private partnerships. And you know, I've asked this question before, and whereas it does not necessarily form within the code care system, I've asked whether, in terms of the arrangements you have with the private laboratories for radiological services, whether you might, as a ministry, consider utilizing or extending it to facilitate some cardiac interventions, such as echocardiograms, such as ECG, such as other diagnostic cases. I know your arrangements with the the laboratories are primarily for X-ray and other radiological interventions. But a plea for persons who may have and may need to do echocardiograms or may need to do interventions which are not covered in this. And it is something that I'm commending to you to have a look at and to see whether it can be done as part of the engagement. I will join in closing, Minister, in saying that, yes, certainly the exchange with the University of Miami and the Hartford health system certainly will redound to the benefit of the Jamaican health sector, because with use of technology, as you have indicated, and with, as you have said in your sectoral presentation last year and this year, use of telemedicine will go a far way in helping our diagnosis of certain conditions from afar, but also will give our local counterparts, both nurses and doctors, the ability to benefit from cutting-edge technology which are used in other jurisdictions which are on a higher health scale than our country. So we on this side are supportive of this, though we still have the concern as to whether our local doctors are not being sufficiently allowed to do what they have been taught to do by the inadequacies of the operating theatres and the system as it exists.
Thank you very much, colleague, as usual, for your questions. Madam Speaker, quickly, just to answer the first question, money was never the issue as it relates to the repairs. Once a commitment was made to spend some extra time and effort doing the repairs, the issue was going in to do the audit. No, well, I mean, yes, of course. I mean, that's how the process works. But the regions had to go in and do the respective audits based on where the institutions are located. And those audits have been ongoing. I actually visited one or two of the institutions to see for myself some of the challenges. And there are challenges from time to time because of the age of some of these plants. Spanish Town Hospital and KPH in particular. There's a challenge almost every other week until we do the overall redevelopment. And well, Cornwall, we all know, has challenges. We have relocated a lot of those procedures to Falmouth. So it really was about the process rather than the resources. The issue of the number of institutions, I'm trying to recall now, but in St. James, it will be Montego Bay Hospital, which is right next door to Cornwall Regional. It's Hospiten, and it's Bay West, if I'm not mistaken, Bay West. In Kingston, we signed with Heart Institute, Medical Associates, Andrews Memorial, the University Hospital of the West Indies, and there's one other. What's the name of the other one? Medical, Andrews, University Hospital, Heart Institute, and there's one other. I don't recall right now, but I've asked for it to be provided, and I'll say it during the course. But they are all reputable institutions, and we have tried to allocate. The negotiations are the same on both in the West and in Kingston. They all have spare capacity, and the attempt is, of course, to use their spare capacity. And we have negotiated, I think, the team that is, prices that are below what they would normally charge, below market value. But ultimately, it's about the patient and the pain and the suffering. I think the country needs to appreciate that elective surgeries may not define what an elective surgery is. So a hernia, for example, you may not die from it, or certainly not immediately, but it's significant pain and suffering. And I've said publicly, even as minister, that it is almost inhumane to have a Jamaican or a citizen of from anywhere waiting 2-3 years for a hernia procedure. And we have to do better. And COVID has only amplified that. So I think from their perspective, if we are to be patient-centric, it is I mean, I've spoken to a few of them. It could not come at a sooner time. And they're really happy with the government for making this procedure work. It has had some challenges, as you say, with some of our local public surgeons, public sector surgeons, in terms of the cases and giving up the cases and coordinating between, who was the original practitioner versus the new, surgeons. But we have had to work through that, and I think we're making some progress. The two other critical questions you asked about registration, part of Code Care is actually to deal with registration in advance. So once we get the applicants, we have about 100 nurses, not all qualify because we're looking for a special, operating theater. We would take their particulars and we would run that process as part of the Code Care initiative. And then for the cardiac interventions, it's something we can look at. What we chose to do was to look at the persons waiting for a very long time. In terms of cardiac care, normally that's more of an emergency. Not all the time, but...
No, Minister, I think you misunderstood the point I'm making. I was saying, just like how you have the arrangements with the private laboratories for X-ray facilities to do like CT scans and MRIs, I'm just asking under that arrangement, not necessarily Code Care, the public-private partnerships you have with them that was established about a year ago and continuing, that you could include some of the cardiac interventions such as echocardiogram and those other ones which are necessary but are not covered under that system and is not able to be afforded by the ordinary patient in the system. Sure.
Okay. No, I take the point, and to the extent we are prepared to explore on that principle. Madam, can I go to the next? Thank you very much, member.
Yes, Minister.
So, Madam Speaker, the next statement involves my recent visit to the Republic of Cuba for the 4th International Convention entitled Cuba Salute 2022 and the 16th Trade Fair entitled Salute para Todos in Cuba between October 17th and 21st. Madam Speaker, in addition to our participation in the convention and the research seminar that I stated above a short while ago, we also participated in a trade fair, and our visit yielded the signing of 2 very important letters of intent between the Ministry of Health and Wellness and the Ministry of Public Health of the Republic of Cuba for, one, the renewal of the technical cooperation agreement for the operation of an ophthalmology center between the Ministry of Health and Wellness of Jamaica and the Ministry of Health of the Republic of Cuba. And that is known popularly by Jamaicans as the Cuban Eye Care Program, which was suspended just prior to COVID, which we are now moving to reinstitute. And the second is the renewal of the Medical Brigade Technical Cooperation Agreement between the Ministry of Health and Wellness of Jamaica and the Ministry of Health of the Republic of Cuba. And that is, of course, the Cuban nurses, some doctors too, that comes in each year to work in our public health system. Madam Speaker, Jamaica's participation has no doubt served, in my mind, to strengthen the long-standing relations with the government of the Republic of Cuba, with which we have collaborated in the public health interests of Jamaicans over many years. Among the programs from which Jamaicans have benefited are the Cuban Medical Brigade, which dates back to 1976, when the government of the Republic of Cuba sent a brigade of 14 doctors at that time, and the medical scholarship program of the government of the Republic of Cuba that has allowed Jamaican students to pursue careers in medical sciences through the Latin American School of Medical Sciences, a project that was funded by the then historic leader of the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro. More than 28,500 doctors, Madam Speaker, just by way of information, from 103 countries have graduated from this program, which to my mind is a significant achievement. And they should be commended for that. Madam Speaker, the 15th Scientific Forum of the Cuban Medical Brigade in Jamaica was held at the National Chest Hospital on November 30, 2020, where 20 works were displayed. and the COVID-19 Cuban-aided response, where 138 Cuban health professionals trained in disaster epidemics management arrived on March 23rd, 2020 to help efforts to prepare the local health system following the first case of COVID-19 on March 10, 2020. Within 3 months following the first arrival, Jamaica, Cuba, we received more than 300 healthcare workers to assist in the fight against the pandemic. Madam Speaker, I have to pause here and really use the opportunity to thank the government and the people of Cuba and the contribution that they made to the COVID response, because the country may need to be reminded that when the first case of COVID arrived or was diagnosed, well, certainly leading up to that, or from the beginning, January of 2020 to March 10th, the country was in a state of almost panic, I would say, if not panic. Certainly fear, certainly uncertainty. And the team, the Ministry of Health, the government of Jamaica, the Honorable Prime Minister, the Parliament, had to plan for significant unexpected occurrence. And all that was happening around us throughout the world, in Europe, developed markets where they had substantially more funds, created great cause for alarm because of that uncertainty. And you know, sometimes we engage in the debate now post the event, 2+ years on, and we're even criticized for a lot of things that we did or didn't do, but many times without context of what was the state of play back then, when every single member of the planet, every single member of, not just Jamaica, of the planet Earth, the 7.8 billion people, I hear we're now 8 billion, I saw recently reported a day or two ago, was in a state of fear. Indeed, I tell people, Madam Speaker, and indulge me please, because I think it's important, because sometimes I get a little impatient about some of the post-COVID conversation. COVID has been the great equalizer, because whether you were a multi-millionaire or a pauper, whether you lived in any of the continents of the world, in a castle or in a farmhouse, you were fearful of the uncertainties related to COVID. And it was a matter of life and death. And it brings me now to the thanks that I think is worthy to the Cuban government and the Cuban people, because in all of this, and I learned this when I went to Cuba, that country sent medical personnel to over 40 countries in the world to provide support as part of the COVID response. The Minister of Health told me that they lost 2 health workers in the process, dying from COVID. No other country in the world has done that, and I think that is worth recording in these chambers as part of saying thanks. So when one of my happiest moments as minister was when I went to the airport and saw the 138 Cuban health workers. I remember vividly the Cuban flag and the Jamaican flag, and I met them with the Cuban ambassador at the time. And believe me when I tell you this, it was a sigh of relief, because I said, we have the troops here to help us with this battle, because it was a war that we're going to embark on. So I want to just say that this was really an outstanding support, and we thank them for that. Back to the script, Madam Speaker. A meeting with the Minister of Public Health and the Republic of Cuba took place on October 19, when several matters were discussed, with much focus on the priority matters for Jamaica, from intentions to renew the technical cooperation agreement, which I spoke to earlier, the medical brigade, to intentions regarding the re-establishment of the ophthalmological center and requests to visit medical facilities of special interest, among other matters. Madam Speaker, I also had the honor of speaking at the closing ceremony on behalf of the Minister of Health, Ministers of Health for the Caribbean region on October 21st, and reiterated the various benefits to which the occasion offered as it relates to health and wellness and achieving Goal 3 of the Sustainable Development Goals. The signing of the letter for the renewal letter of intent for the renewal of the technical cooperation agreement for the operation of an ophthalmology center between the ministry and the Cuban government, Madam Speaker, took place on October 21st. This signing outlines our intent to resume operation in early 2023. I'm hoping that by the first quarter, meaning this financial year, with an expected arrival of a project technical team from Cuba this month of November. So there are discussions taking place, and the hope is that the technical team or advanced team will come to do the assessment, location assessment, equipment assessment, and begin the process of putting those things in motion. So when the team actually arrives next year, we can go right into the work as opposed to any sort of preparation. That's highly anticipated because we do have a backlog of these cases, and clearly the system is just not enough to deal with all of them. We have benefited significantly from previous agreements. There was also, Madam Speaker, the signing of the letter for the renewal of the Medical Brigade Technical Cooperation Agreement, which will mean that we will renew that agreement, which expires in February of next year, 2023, and we will renew that in order to continue the benefits that we derive from the Cuban medical team that comes into Jamaica and are dispatched to other parts of the country, hospitals. Madam Speaker, I took the opportunity while I was there to invite the Minister of Health of Cuba to visit Jamaica. And that's something that I've raised at the level of our cabinet. And I think I think we need to say thanks in a way, in a special way. And I believe that all are agreed that this is important. So, Madam Speaker, this is my comments on this visit. I thought it was a very beneficial visit, and I think that the Jamaican people will be better off for it. Thank you very much.
Member from St. Mary Central.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Minister, you know, not very often you go away and people say you come back with goodies. This is one time you have come back with something. And I mean, I don't say it with any negative thing, but it is something that the people of Jamaica have not only recognized but have embraced over the years. The support of our brothers and sisters in Cuba to the Jamaican people from as far back as you have indicated in the 70s when we first had that cooperation that took 14 physicians to Jamaica. Cuba has always been part of what has practiced what has been termed as health internationalism, and Jamaica has been one of the beneficiaries over the years. The fact too that many Jamaicans are unable to do their day-to-day activity because of the effect of cataracts and other ailments of the eye, which they have depended on for many years through the Cuban eye care program, as you have indicated is colloquially called. And many are waiting for the re-establishment of this cooperation between Jamaica and Cuba, and I'm happy that this has been borne out of your recent visit to Cuba. Minister, the country from as far back as 2005, when the program started originally with Jamaicans traveling to Cuba to have this surgery done, funded by the Venezuelan government, but provided the facilities in Cuba. And subsequently in 2010, when it was, I wouldn't say repatriated, but brought back to Jamaica for the care to be done here with the physicians and the surgeons coming down, is something that has almost become part of the local health delivery system in Jamaica. And I'm happy that whereas our own ophthalmologists are unable to provide within the system the amount of care for those patients who need it, and certainly this will help to not only to give those as has been surgery for them to see again, but it also aid productivity in the country because many people can't work because they're blind. So we are very happy that this program has been reestablished, and we are also happy that the program of cooperation, the Medical Brigade Technical Cooperation Agreement, has been renewed, and that we will continue as a country to benefit from the progress that Cuba has had in health delivery, not only in terms of doctors and so, but in terms of, we could also go one step further in terms of the level of medication, vaccines, and all the other medical developments that they have done under very trying circumstances. So, as I'll close as I start, Minister. We're happy that you went and one of the things and finally brought back something good. Thanks.
Madam Speaker, okay, I have the list of the hospitals, but I'll say it in closing. You want to go ahead?
Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker.
May I proceed, Member?
Thank you very much. Minister, I must say that...
Member, do you have a question, or you are speaking as the opposition spokesperson as it relates to this statement?
Madam Speaker, I'm sure that you would have recognized that the spokesperson has already spoken, and therefore I'm standing to make some questions.
Okay, please submit your question.
Minister, I am very pleased to have listened to the two statements that you made. The program to which you referred, Salud para Todos, actually means something in Cuba. I'm not sure if you're aware. It means health for everyone. And it is not just for that program, but it is the philosophy. And it is against that background, Minister, that I wanted to ask a few questions as it relates to the report and what is to come. Minister, if you could just explain a little bit as to, I know that you're just in the process, you know, and persons are going to come and do their assessment and so on. But I believe that it is important for us to ensure that we have what I call a broader circulation of public education around how people apply and access the program, program. So I wanted just a little bit, if you were thinking of what had happened before and what kind of changes you'd want to make to assure the public. Also, Minister, given the contribution of the Medical Brigade and the scholarship program of which you spoke, I was wondering if we were now at a point where we would begin to look at the transition of Cuban graduates coming back into Jamaica and practicing, and in particular, those who come back as vets. As vets, veterinary surgeons, yes. And then, following from that, since the program would have expired, the agreement we had would have expired in 2018, I was wondering what had happened between 2018 and 2022 to those individuals who were in need of that service. And if you are aware of how many that would be and what would have been the implications of that. And then, Minister, I was also wondering, because this program serves such a great need, as we have said, I believe that healthcare in Jamaica, it really is we said COVID-19 was a kind of equalizer. Healthcare is becoming an equalizer as well. We have far too many people who can't do dialysis as they need to, surgeries for coronary artery disease, and all of those others. And I was just wondering, what was the thinking of the Ministry of Health in terms of how we ensure that there is a more affordable way for those who really and truly can't afford it to be able to access these services, to be able to live a quality life.
Thank you. Thank you, member, and thank you, Madam Speaker. On the issue of the iCare program and the what may be different, yes, there is a vision of a slightly adjusted approach. In fact, I discussed it with the minister and with the particular agency that's responsible for providing the persons and helping to vet, and that is to provide more optometrists, because I think we have to spend more time on the prevention. So you're very correct. I think the eye care program to date has been more around cure, surgeries. So what I made a request for are additional optometrists and some additional ophthalmologists, with the intention of directing them into the primary healthcare infrastructure, so they do community interventions. For example, in the schools, you know, I give the story every day that one of my children had, one day I saw him looking up at the TV, going to prep school, and you know, kind of squinting the eyes, and that's when I discovered that he had and oftentimes we misinterpret and misdiagnose and miss those things. And even some of our kids in the schools are seen as deviants when they can't see as well, or they're not hearing as well, that sort of thing. So I think this screening is absolutely critical. So yes, that's a big part of it. The other part that I inquired on is to see to what extent we can team up through some public-private arrangements. And there's one entity here in Jamaica, a large established business, that has an interest in doing outreach around eye care, testing, providing glasses, and so on. And so a conversation has been taking place about that. I can't give specifics yet, but the answer to your question is yes, there is an intention to adjust the program to a more broad-based, community-based intervention. The issue of the graduates and their participation here, and you mentioned vets in particular, I agree with you. I think it's something we need to look at, and I'll raise it with the team to see what else can be done. But the fact is, I've heard of case, and it is a little astonishing that we send Jamaicans to study, and then when they are complete their study, they are told that they can't practice here. I mean, I don't understand it. And so something has to be done about that. And I've had a few cases which I've had to deal with. The issue of what has happened between 2020 and 2022, when the program was suspended or terminated because the contract had ended, it's not much different from the backlog of surgery cases. And indeed, what it means is that many either would have had to get help through the private space, or align themselves through some of the few other hospitals that we have, like KPH, to get the care, because we do offer it, just not enough capacity. But I would dare say that there are persons who would have been waiting. And so one of the things that we intend to do with the program is to do a similar principle of clearing up that backlog to try and get that over with. And then you spoke about what is going to be done to make healthcare the great equalizer. Madam Speaker, that would take an entire evening, which we're not going to detain ourselves much on that. What I will tell you, and I don't want you to think that it is a political statement, although it could be interpreted as such, is that this government has done more for public health than any other government since 1962. And, Madam Speaker, I hear the rhetoric and the talk about what we're doing and not doing, but I will challenge anybody, day or night, in the public square or in Parliament, to show the money that has been spent on health, the value that has been created for health, the partnership that have been established around healthcare. The fact is, a lot more of the noise is coming from the detractors than from the people who are benefiting. And normally we don't talk about the achievements. We only talk about the outlier events. I am not saying that we are perfect or that the system is perfect, because it is far from. What I am prepared to say that we're coming from a distance, and under this Andrew Holness administration, we have caught up more mileage in advancing the system than any other government has done since independence. The health infrastructure and the build-out that is taking place, colleague, you opened the door, so I'm going to walk right through it.
On a point of clarification. No, on a point of clarification, yes. Minister, because I do not want you to go where I didn't ask. Right. I was not making a political statement. Right. I really rose and asked the question because of the number of Jamaicans who have come to me about their surgeries of $2 million because of coronary artery disease. Those who have come to me because they can't eat food this week because they need to find the money for dialysis. And how do I help? So honestly, I came here as an interested representative of the people, not asking for a political point, not making it as a political point, but because it is indeed something that affects the people I represent. I don't know if it doesn't affect those you represent.
And I fully appreciate the perspective that you have come from, and I think you are well within your right to carry out that responsibility. I am similarly responding on behalf of an administration, and I say so respectfully and humbly. I am responding on behalf of an administration that made a commitment to transform public health, that has put aside through the IDB $100 million in the first instance, which is going to result in transformation at Spanish Town, St. Ann's Bay, Maypen, not to mention several other institutions. And in addition to that, we have unveiled things like a primary health care renewal program that will now deal with prevention. Because, remember again, not going to take a lot of time, public health is going to have to come to terms, all of us that is, with Minister, the challenge that curative measures alone are unsustainable. We're going to have to change lifestyle, and I've been at pains to say that.
Can I?
At the same time, one second, member, and then you can.
If you don't have a point of order, just allow.
I just ask for clarification, Minister.
At the same time, member, the truth is that we have seen escalating cost because of the sickness profile of the population, largely linked to lifestyle. So we're going to have to come to terms with financing, which I spoke to in the sectoral. How do we finance it? We're going to have to come to terms with lifestyle changes, but we are doing a significant amount of work in terms of building out the infrastructure, adding new doctors and nurses to the extent that we can access them. And again, it's going to be a journey, and I think we're well on our way, even though I agree with you that there are still a lot of challenges to overcome. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member from Central Manchester.
Mike.
Yes, thank you. You said that this administration has done the most for public health. Yes. You're referring to the spend because, you know, and your last statement a while ago spoke to the increased costs. So you're referring to the spend that you have done on public. And I will agree with you, but I think a more intensive interrogation of the history ought to be done to see the benefits from what spend was done over the years.
And I'm prepared to do that. And I agree with you that there's an inflationary effect and so on. But all I'm saying is that a lot has been done, a lot is being done, but I take the member's point that a lot more needs to be done. And it's going to take all of us to get it done. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister. House Leader?
Sorry, Madam Speaker, I apologize. I had the accurate institutions, if you will allow me. So the institutions are in the West, G-West Medical, Surgery and Surgery Center, Hospital, and Montego Bay Hospital and Urology Center. And then in Kingston, or the corporate area, Andrews Memorial, the Heart Institute of the Caribbean, Medical Associates, the University Hospital of the West Indies, and Winchester Surgical and Medical Institute. Those are the institutions that we have signed on to Code Care. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Announcements.
Laid on the table of the House today are copies of the annual report for e-learning Jamaica Limited for 2021-2022.
Bills brought from the Senate.
The following is a message from the President of the Senate to the Honorable House of Representatives. I have the honor to advise the Honorable House of Representatives that on the 11th day of November 2022, a bill entitled An Act to Validate and Confirm the Acts of the National Irrigation Commission Limited, done in good faith by persons acting on behalf of the National Irrigation Commission Limited, and to indemnify the National Irrigation Commission Limited, its agents and its officers against liability for actions done in good faith and for connected matters, was passed in the Senate with 3 amendments for which the Senate desires the concurrence of the Honorable House. Signed, and the amendments are circulated. They're signed Thomas Tavares Finson, OJ, CD, QC, JP, President of the Senate.
Madam Speaker, I now ask for your consent for the Senate amendments to a bill entitled An Act to Validate and Confirm the Acts of the National Irrigation Commission Limited, done in good faith by persons acting on behalf of the National Irrigation Commission Limited, and to indemnify the National Irrigation Commission Limited, its agents and its officers against liability for actions done in good faith and for connected matters, to be now considered and approved.
Madam
Consent
Speaker,
given.
Madam Speaker, just a note on this, because these amendments were so inconsequential. It is to really change the recognition that we now have a king, and it's a him rather than the former monarch. That could have been done by law reform. It really didn't have to come to the Parliament for the Parliament's time to be taken up in this way. But we have no difficulty with it. But I just suggest next time it can be done automatically by law reform.
I'm grateful. Madam Speaker, I now ask that the Senate amendment.
I had indicated consent given. Go ahead, Minister.
Yes, as was said, well, my remarks were already made. So I just simply say I concur. Madam Speaker, I now ask that the Senate amendments to the Act to validate and confirm the acts of the National Irrigation Commission Limited, done in good faith by persons acting on behalf of the National Irrigation Commission Limited, and to indemnify the National Irrigation Commission Limited, its agents and its officers against liability for actions done in good faith and for connected matters, be now approved.
Those in favour? Those against? The ayes have it. Petitions, papers, reports from committees, notices of motions given orally, questions and answers to questions, motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice, motions relating to the sitting of the House, motions for leave to introduce bills, presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained, public business.
Madam Speaker, it's not proposed to do any further business today. So I now ask that the House be adjourned until next Tuesday, the 21st, at 2 p.m.
The question is that the House be adjourned until November 22nd at 2 p.m. sharp. Those in favour? Those against? The ayes have it. This Honourable House now stands adjourned.
Your government is working for you. On the East Coast, there's the Southern Coastal Highway Improvement Project.
The highway, which began in January 2017, is now slated to end in March 2025. Another segment under the Southern Coastal Highway Improvement Project is the Maypen to Williams Field, which is approximately 81% complete. Next stop,